I didn't take the job at the old amusement park because I wanted to. Let's be clear, this was a last resort. Bills were piling up, and I was desperate. The ad sounded simple enough. Night shift as a caretaker for a park long past its glory days. Just keep an eye out for trespassers and report any damage. When I first saw the place, it felt like stepping into a postcard that had been left out in the rain too long. Rusted carousels, twisted roller coaster tracks swallowed by vines, and a Ferris wheel that creaked softly even without wind. But something about the silence there wasn't right. Too heavy, like the park itself was holding its breath. The guy who handed me the keys didn't stick around long. He shoved a sealed envelope into my hand and muttered something about rules before speeding off. Inside the envelope was a list of instructions, weird ones. Walk the perimeter at 9 p.m., but don't enter the House of Mirrors. If you hear music from the carousel, stay away. Manually turn the Ferris wheel at 11 p.m. No exceptions. And the one that really got me, if you see anyone after midnight, do not engage. Go to the security cabin and lock the door. I laughed nervously, thinking it was some kind of initiation prank. But the look in the guy's eyes said otherwise. I should have trusted that look. The first night felt off, even before anything strange happened. Walking the perimeter, the crunch of gravel under my boots was the only sound, but I kept feeling like someone was pacing me just out of sight. When I passed the House of Mirrors, I stopped cold. It was dark inside, but something caught my eye, my reflection. Except it wasn't quite right. I stepped back, but the reflection stayed, staring straight at me. My chest tightened, and I turned away quickly, muttering to myself that it was just my nerves. That's when I noticed the footprints. Fresh ones, leading from the carousel toward the Ferris wheel. Problem was I hadn't seen or heard anyone else in the park. At 11 p.m., I went to the Ferris wheel to follow the instructions, feeling a mix of dread and stupidity. The thing was massive, and turning it by hand felt pointless. But as I started pushing the lever, I heard it. Faint, discordant music drifting through the air, like an old music box playing underwater. I froze, my hands slipping from the lever. The sound wasn't coming from the carousel. It was too close, too wrong. My instincts screamed to leave, but I gritted my teeth and kept turning the wheel. The moment it completed a full rotation, the music stopped abruptly, like someone had yanked the plug on a speaker. My hands were shaking, and I couldn't get back to the cabin fast enough. By the second night, I was already questioning my decision to stay, but quitting meant going back to unpaid bills and eviction notices. So, I showed up again, armed with a flashlight and a sinking feeling in my gut. Things escalated quickly this time. As I passed the carousel during my perimeter check, I could swear I heard laughter, soft like kids playing tag. I stopped and shone my flashlight over the chipped paint and warped horses, but the ride was still. Just as I was about to move on, the sound changed. Footsteps, quick, shuffling footsteps, darting around the other side of the carousel. My heart was pounding, but I kept telling myself it had to be an animal. Still, I didn't stick around to find out. Back at the cabin, I decided to check the security footage, hoping to reassure myself. Instead, it made everything worse. The cameras showed the park just as I'd seen it, empty and dead. Then, around 10:30 p.m., a small figure darted across the screen. It looked like a kid, but the way it moved didn't sit right with me. Too jerky, like someone trying to imitate a child. I rewound the footage, squinting to make out details. Just as I paused it, the figure turned toward the camera for a split second. Its face, if you could call it that, was blank. No eyes, no mouth, just smooth skin. And then it was gone, like it had evaporated into the shadows. That same night, something pulled me back toward the House of Mirrors. I didn't want to go, but it felt like the air around me was heavier there, tugging at me like a magnet. As I walked past, I could hear faint whispers, my name, over and over in a voice that sounded like mine, but wrong. I clutched the flashlight, so tightly my knuckles ached. My reflection was back, standing still even when I moved. This time, I didn't stop to stare. I hurried past, eyes fixed on the ground. But that chill, the feeling of being watched, stayed with me all the way to the Ferris wheel. At 11 p.m., the wheel creaked louder than usual as I turned it. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something or someone creeping closer. The sound of the wheel grinding against its rusted gears masked everything else. So when I heard it again, the organ music, it felt like it was coming from inside my head. It was louder now, and the melody was broken, almost mocking. I dropped the lever and spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the empty park, shrouded in darkness. But then I saw it, a shadow at the top of the wheel. It wasn't shaped like a person. It was too thin, too long, and it swayed as if it were hanging on by a thread. I didn't sleep much after that, but the third night came anyway. This time I noticed something different as soon as I arrived. The park didn't feel empty anymore. The air had that electric charge, like before a thunderstorm, and every creak of the rides felt deliberate. Walking past the carousel, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. The horses, those cracked, peeling animals, had shifted. They were all facing the same direction now, their hollow eyes pointed toward the Ferris wheel. I wanted to tell myself it had been like that all along, but deep down I knew better. My hands shook as I completed the perimeter, dread building with each step. When I reached the security cabin to check the cameras, the screens were already flickering. Static crawled across every feed, but here and there it would clear just enough for me to see. On one screen, the House of Mirrors glowed faintly, like someone had lit candles inside. On another, the carousel was spinning, slow and steady, but the lights on it were dead. Then came the worst, the Ferris wheel. A figure stood at the base of it, motionless, staring up at the top. Its face was obscured, but its silhouette was unmistakable. Long, thin, and swaying, just like the shadow I'd seen the night before. My stomach dropped when it turned suddenly and seemed to look directly at the camera. I sat frozen in the cabin, my eyes locked on the screen. The figure didn't move closer, but it didn't leave either. It just stood there, swaying slightly, as if it were waiting for something. Then, the camera feed cut out completely, leaving me in silence. A sharp knock at the cabin door made me jump out of my seat. My first instinct was to ignore it, but the knock came again, harder this time. I reached for the flashlight, heart hammering in my chest, and crept to the door. "Don't open it," I whispered to myself. But when the third knock came, loud enough to rattle the frame, I couldn't stop myself. I opened it. No one was there. The flashlight beam revealed only the gravel path stretching into darkness, but the air was colder than before, biting against my skin. I stepped outside, scanning the area, and that's when I saw them, footprints leading away from the cabin. They were small, like a child's, but uneven, as if whoever made them was dragging one foot. Against every instinct, I followed the trail. It led me back to the carousel, which was now lit up, its organ playing that warped, haunting tune. The horses were still, but it felt like their hollow eyes were watching me. I stood there, paralyzed, until a flash of movement broke the trance. A figure darted between the rides, just out of reach of the flashlight's beam. I wanted to turn back, to lock myself in the cabin and wait for sunrise, but something about the figure compelled me to follow. It moved with an unnatural speed, zigzagging between the rusted attractions, and every time I thought I'd lost it, there it was again, just ahead. My flashlight flickered as I approached the House of Mirrors, and I knew I shouldn't have gone near it. But the whispers started again, louder this time, not just calling my name, but laughing, mocking. The door to the building creaked open on its own, and against every ounce of common sense I had left, I stepped inside. The air was damp and cold, and my footsteps echoed unervingly as I entered the maze of glass. My reflection stared back at me from every angle, but something was wrong. They weren't moving the way I was. Some stayed still, while others lagged behind, watching. Then one of them smiled. My stomach flipped. It wasn't my smile. The lights above me flickered, and in the stuttering glow, the reflections in the mirrors began to change. The room wasn't empty anymore. I could see people, figures, moving in the background of the mirrors, their faces obscured, their movements slow and deliberate. But when I turned around, the space behind me was still empty. I backed away, my pulse thundering in my ears, but the mirrors seemed to stretch endlessly, pulling me deeper into the maze. No matter which way I turned, my reflections were wrong. Some didn't move at all. Others twitched unnaturally, their limbs jerking in ways I couldn't replicate. Then I saw something that made my breath catch. In one of the mirrors far behind me was a crowd. Men, women, and children, all standing perfectly still, staring with hollow eyes and grotesque grins. They were dressed like they'd stepped out of another time, their clothes dusty and tattered. I spun around, expecting to see them, but there was nothing, just the suffocating silence of the House of Mirrors. That's when I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere deeper in the maze. My flashlight beam bounced off the mirrors, making it impossible to tell where the sound was coming from. The whispers returned, louder now, overlapping and distorted, like a radio signal gone wrong. "You brought us back," one voice hissed, followed by another, softer one that sounded disturbingly like my own. "Stay." I didn't wait to hear more. I bolted, stumbling through the narrow corridors, my reflection's faces twisting and distorting as I passed. The exit seemed to stretch farther away with every step, but I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for air. When I finally made it outside, the park was unrecognizable. The rides were lit up, glowing with an eerie, flickering light, and the air was thick with the sound of distant laughter and faint music. The carousel was spinning on its own now, the horses bobbing up and down in jerky, mechanical movements. The Ferris wheel creaked as it turned, though no one was at the controls. Shadows flitted between the rides, too fast to catch, but they were there. I could feel their presence. And then I saw them, the figures from the mirrors stepping out into the open. Their faces were pale and featureless, except for those stretched, grotesque grins. They moved toward me, their heads tilting unnaturally, their arms outstretched. I ran. I didn't have a plan, just a primal urge to get as far away as possible. The security cabin was my only hope, but when I reached it, the door wouldn't budge. I pounded on it, screamed for help, but no one was there. Behind me, the shadows were closing in, their distorted laughter echoing in my ears. I grabbed a nearby piece of wood, desperate to defend myself. But as I turned to face them, the lights of the park all went out at once. The silence that followed was suffocating. For a moment, I thought I was alone, but then I felt it, a cold hand on my shoulder. I don't remember much after that. When I turned around, there was nothing there. No figure, no shadow, just the oppressive darkness. But the handprint on my shoulder stayed, cold and damp like something had been gripping me. Somehow, I managed to force the cabin door open and lock myself inside. My hands were trembling so badly, I could barely hold the flashlight. The park outside was dead silent, but I could still feel it alive around me, watching, waiting. I sat in the corner, clutching the piece of wood like it was my lifeline, too afraid to move. Hours must have passed like that, but it felt like an eternity. The faint glow of dawn crept through the window, and as soon as it was bright enough, I bolted. I didn't even lock the gate behind me, I just ran. For days after, I couldn't shake the feeling that the park hadn't let me leave entirely. I found smudged handprints on my jacket that I hadn't noticed before, small ones like a child's. And then came the text message. "You did enough to keep them quiet for now." It was from the number the supervisor had used to hire me. I wanted to ask what he meant, but I couldn't bring myself to reply. Now, even in the safety of my home, I sometimes hear it. The faint, broken tune of the carousel's organ, like it's calling me back. I don't know if it's my imagination or if the park is still watching, but I'll never go near that place again. Not for any amount of money.